Hand it over, Evander. The badge, the access card. Now, do not make this harder than the spectacle you've already created in the ICU. The voice belonged to Administrator Crestwood, a man whose tailored suit cost more than Evander's annual nursing salary, and it cut through the sterile silence of the executive office like a scalpel through necrotic tissue. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the grey skyline of the city wept a steady, miserable rain, blurring the world into a smear of slate and charcoal. Evander Dornhurst stood motionless, his knuckles white as he gripped the plastic ID card that had defined his existence for 20 years. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He simply looked at the men destroying his life, placed the badge on the mahogany desk with a hollow clack, and felt the heavy, suffocating weight of absolute professional ruin settle upon his shoulders. The silence in the room following the surrender of the badge was not empty. It was pressurized. It was the specific, ringing silence that follows a code blue when the rhythm fails to return. The silence of cessation. Evander Dornhurst, a man of 45 with greying temples and hands that had started thousands of IVs, looked across the expanse of the desk. Administrator Crestwood sat with the rigid posture of a man who managed liabilities, not people. To his right sat Dr. Cedric Graysonhall. Cedric was younger, handsome in a way that played well with donors, and currently staring at a spot on the carpet with feigned fascination. It was Cedric who had ordered the heparin bolus for the post-op craniotomy patient. It was Evander who had refused to administer it, citing the plummeting platelet count and the active drain output. It was Evander who had physically blocked the port when Cedric tried to push it himself in a fit of ego-driven rage. The patient had lived. The patient's family had thanked them. But the hierarchy had been challenged, and in the calculus of St. Jude's Medical Center, insubordination against a star neurosurgeon was a terminal condition. "We are framing this as a restructuring of the critical care team," Crestwood said, his voice smooth, devoid of the friction of conscience. He pushed a packet of papers across the mahogany surface. "If you sign the NDA, the severance package is 6 months. If you fight this, we will report you to the Board of Nursing for practicing medicine without a license, regarding your obstruction of Dr. Graysonhall's orders. We have the statements ready." Evander looked at Cedric. "You know what would have happened, Cedric. You know the partial thromboplastin time was through the roof. He would have bled out into his brain stem before you finished your coffee." Cedric finally looked up. His eyes were hard, defensive. "Clinical judgment is the purview of the physician, Nurse Dornhurst. Your job is execution, not debate. You undermined confidence in the attending physician in front of the family. That is unforgivable." "I saved his life," Evander said softly. "You created a liability," Crestwood corrected, tapping the papers. "Sign, take your things, escort yourself out. Security has been notified to sweep your locker." Evander looked at the papers. The severance was substantial. It was silence money. It was an admission that they knew he was right, but that he was inconvenient. He picked up the pen. His hand didn't shake. He signed his name, the loops of the E and D, precise, practiced. He wasn't signing because he agreed. He was signing because he was tired. He had fought the war against incompetence and ego for 2 decades, and today the enemy had flanked him. "Done," Evander said, sliding the papers back. "Good," Crestwood said, already opening his laptop, dismissing Evander from existence before he had even left the room. "Please don't linger in the lobby." Evander walked out of the administrative suite, the plush carpet swallowing his footsteps. The transition from the executive wing to the clinical floors was always jarring, the shift from mahogany and quiet to linoleum and alarms. He walked past the ICU double doors, the place where he had spent more hours than in his own home. He saw Clementine Hartmore at the nurse's station, holding a phone to her ear, her face pale. Clementine saw him. She dropped the phone to her shoulder, her eyes widened, scanning him. No badge, a box of personal items in his hands, the universal symbol of the terminated. "Evander?" she whispered as he passed. "They didn't. Surely they didn't." "Take care of bed 4, Clem," Evander said, his voice raspy. "Watch his potassium. He's labile." "Evander, stop. We can call the union rep. We can—" "It's done, Clementine." He didn't stop. He couldn't. If he stopped, he might break, and he refused to give Cedric Grayson Hall the satisfaction of seeing him weep. He walked past the trauma bays, past the waiting room filled with anxious families, and through the sliding glass doors into the humid, grey afternoon. The automatic doors hissed shut behind him. The air outside was thick with exhaust and rain. He stood on the curb, a cardboard box containing a stethoscope, a framed photo of a dog that had died 3 years ago, and a mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in his hands. He was Evander Dornhurst, RN, CCRN, TNCC, and now he was just a middle-aged man on a sidewalk, unemployed and obsolete. The rain picked up, a cold drizzle that seemed designed to seep into the soul. Evander didn't hail a cab. He didn't call an Uber. He needed the walk. He needed the physical exertion to burn off the adrenaline that was currently souring in his blood. His apartment was 4 miles away, a straight shot down the urban corridor that separated the medical district from the residential high-rises. He began to walk, clutching the box to his chest to keep the contents dry. His mind replayed the meeting in a loop. You created a liability. A liability. Not a savior. Not a safeguard. A liability. As he crossed 4th Avenue, the city moved around him with indifferent aggression. Delivery trucks honked, pedestrians with umbrellas jostled him, and the low hum of urban machinery drowned out his thoughts. He felt a phantom vibration in his pocket, his pager. He reached for it before realizing he had turned it in. That reflex, that constant state of readiness, was a hard-wired pathway in his brain. What happened to that energy now? Where did the vigilance go when there was no one left to watch over? He passed a bistro where he and the night shift used to grab breakfast and mimosas on Tuesday mornings. He passed the park where he'd sat after losing his first pediatric patient, staring at the ducks until the sun went down. The city was a map of his trauma, every corner associated with a shift, a ghost, a save, a loss. By the time he reached the halfway point, his shoes were soaked. The box was damp. He felt foolish, a 45-year-old man walking home in the rain like a cliché from a bad movie. "You're better off," he muttered to himself. No more missed holidays. No more Cedric. No more coding 20-year-olds on Friday nights. But it felt like a lie. The hospital was a meat grinder, yes, but it was his meat grinder. It was where he made sense. Out here, among the coffee shops and boutiques, he was a ghost. He turned onto the suspension bridge that spanned the river, a massive steel structure that usually hummed with the sound of commuters. Today, the traffic was strangely light, though he could see a gridlock forming ahead near the interchange. He paused at the railing, looking down at the grey water churning below. Ring. His personal cell phone buzzed. He ignored it. It was probably Clementine, or Human Resources, realizing they forgot a form. Ring. He kept walking. The traffic on the bridge had come to a complete standstill. Drivers were getting out of their cars, looking up at the sky. A strange sound began to vibrate in Evander's chest, a low, thumping percussion that he felt before he heard. Thwop, 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 thwop. It was a rhythm he recognized. Not the standard medical evacuation choppers, the light, agile Eurocopters that ferried heart attacks to St. Jude's. This was deeper, heavier. It sounded like war. Evander stopped. The air pressure seemed to drop. The sound grew from a vibration to a roar, drowning out the honking cars. He looked up, squinting against the rain. Coming in low over the skyline, banking hard around the skyscrapers, were two black shapes. They moved with aggressive precision, cutting through the weather like sharks through water. Black Hawks, UH-60S, unmarked save for a faint grey tail number. Evander frowned. This wasn't a parade route. There were no air shows scheduled. The aircraft were flying tactically, low and fast. They were descending, directly toward the bridge interchange. The wind from their rotors began to whip the water below into a frenzy. Debris on the bridge, coffee cups, loose papers, began to swirl. Drivers abandoned their vehicles, running toward the sides of the bridge, phones out, recording. Evander didn't run. He watched, analyzing the approach vector. They were aiming for the wide intersection of the off-ramp, 100 yards ahead of him. It was a dangerous landing zone, flanked by streetlights and suspension cables. "What in the hell?" he whispered. The lead helicopter flared, its nose pitching up violently to bleed speed. The downwash hit Evander, nearly knocking the box from his hands. The roar was deafening now, a physical assault on the senses. The landing gear slammed onto the asphalt of the intersection, sparking against the road. The second helicopter hovered above, riding shotgun, a gunner visible in the side door, scanning the perimeter. This wasn't an emergency landing. This was an extraction. The lead helicopter hadn't even fully settled on its struts before the side door slid open. 4 figures spilled out, moving with the distinct, fluid urgency of special operators. They wore tactical gear but civilian clothes, khaki pants, plate carriers, no insignia. They carried carbines, held at the low ready. Panic rippled through the stalled traffic. People screamed, ducking behind dashboards. Evander stood his ground near the railing. He was frozen, not by fear, but by confusion. He watched the team fan out, establishing a perimeter. Then, a 5th figure jumped from the bird. She was different. She wore a flight suit, dark grey, with a headset around her neck and a tablet in her hand. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, efficient bun. This was Odette Stormvale. Even from this distance, Evander could see the terrified intensity in her posture. She wasn't a soldier. She was a handler, a fixer. She spun around, scanning the terrified civilians cowering by their cars. She ignored the guns, ignored the traffic. She was looking for something specific. She raised a megaphone to her lips. The electronic screech of feedback cut through the rotor wash. "Remain in your vehicles." Her voice was amplified, commanding, but laced with a desperate edge. "We are looking for a medical professional." Evander tightened his grip on his box. A doctor, he thought. They need a doctor. There had to be a dozen in the cars stuck on the bridge. Odette Stormvale scanned the crowd, her eyes frantic. She consulted the tablet in her hand, then looked up again, shouting into the megaphone. "We are tracking a cell phone signal to this grid. We are looking for Evander Dornhurst." Evander's heart stopped. The world narrowed down to the sound of his own name, echoing off the steel girders of the bridge. Evander Dornhurst. He took a step back. This had to be a hallucination, the stress of the firing, the lack of sleep. "Evander Dornhurst!" Odette screamed, dropping the megaphone and cupping her hands. "Where is the nurse?" The operators were moving down the line of cars, checking faces. One of them, a massive man with a beard, looked toward the railing. He saw the lone figure standing in the rain, holding a cardboard box. He saw the scrubs Evander was still wearing, navy blue, St. Jude's embroidered on the chest. The operator pointed. "Contact, 3 o'clock." The entire team pivoted. Odette Stormvale's head snapped toward him. She began to run. She didn't run like an administrator. She ran like someone whose life expectancy was measured in seconds. Evander didn't move. He couldn't. The absurdity of the moment pinned him to the concrete. 10 minutes ago, he was a liability. Now, federal agents were landing military aircraft on a suspension bridge to find him. Odette reached him, breathless, raindrops clinging to her eyelashes. Up close, he saw the terror in her eyes. It was the same look families had when the monitor flatlined. "Are you Dornhurst?" she demanded, grabbing his arm. Her grip was iron. Yes, I'm Evander. I see you. Trauma certified? You ran the ECMO protocols for the senator's daughter last year. I was the primary, yes. But I don't work there anymore. I was just fired. I don't care if you're a convicted felon, Odette snapped. We have a situation that requires your specific skill set. Right now. My specific, I'm a nurse, lady, not a surgeon. If you need a doctor, go to St. Jude's. We don't need a doctor, she yelled, her voice cracking over the roar of the rotors. We have doctors. We have the Surgeon General of the United States in that chopper, and he is useless right now because he doesn't know how to troubleshoot the specific pump failure on a MK5 portable bypass unit in a non-pressurized cabin. You wrote the manual on it. Evander stared at her. The MK5, a prototype portable heart-lung machine. St. Jude's had been a testing site. He had written the troubleshooting guide, mostly because the engineering manual was gibberish. The patient? Evander asked, his instincts overriding his confusion. Critical. Failing. We have 20 minutes of battery left, and the flow rate is erratic. If the pump stops, he dies. If he dies, the geopolitical consequences are catastrophic. She looked at the box in his hands, the picture of the dog, the mug. She slapped it out of his hands. The mug shattered on the wet asphalt. The frame cracked. "Leave it," she ordered. "You're coming with us. I can't just— Evander!" She grabbed his face with both hands, forcing him to look at her. There is a man dying in the air. He is bleeding out and his heart has stopped, and that machine is the only thing keeping blood in his brain. You are the only person within 500 miles who knows how to fix the airlock glitch on the MK5 without rebooting the whole system. Get on the bird. Evander looked at the shattered mug. Then he looked at the Black Hawk, its rotors spinning a violent halo in the rain. He felt a surge of electricity, a familiar, addictive rush. The shift wasn't over. It was just beginning. "Let's go," Evander said. They ran. They sprinted toward the waiting helicopter, ducking under the rotors. The heat from the engines was intense. Strong hands grabbed Evander's vest and hauled him up into the cabin. Inside, it was a cramped, red-lit nightmare of medical equipment and wires. And there, in the center, strapped to a stretcher, was a man with a chest cracked open, covered in sterile drapes. Huddled over him, looking pale and terrified, was a woman Evander recognized instantly. Norabella Ravensmere, the chief of surgery, the woman who had signed off on his firing an hour ago without even meeting him. She looked up, her hands deep in the patient's chest cavity. When she saw Evander, her expression shifted from arrogance to desperate relief. "Dornhurst!" she shouted over the turbine whine. "Thank God. The pump is alarming high pressure. I don't know what to do." Evander knelt beside the machine, his hands moving automatically to the control panel. He didn't look at Norabella. He looked at the flow rate. "Headsets on," the pilot shouted. "Lifting in 3, 2. The helicopter lurched upward, the ground falling away. Evander was no longer the fired nurse walking home in the rain. He was the most important person in the sky. The interior of the UH-60 Black Hawk was a deafening, vibrating coffin of noise and red tactical light. Evander Dornhurst was on his knees, his shins pressing painfully against the metal grating of the floor, his hands slick with sterile gel and sweat. The world outside the open bay doors was a blur of rain-streaked grey and the dizzying drop to the river below. But Evander's universe had shrunk to the 12 square inches of the Mk5 portable bypass unit's control interface. The machine was screaming, a high-pitched electronic wail that cut through the thumping rotor wash. "Pressure is critical," Norabella Ravensmere shouted, her voice cracking over the internal comms headset someone had jammed onto Evander's head. "It's reading obstruction in the arterial line. I've checked the cannula site. It's clear. It has to be a clot in the pump head." Evander looked at the digital readout. Error 404. Flow dynamics mismatch. It wasn't a clot. It was the airlock sensor tripping because of the barometric pressure change during the rapid ascent. The machine thought there was air in the line, so it was clamping down to prevent an embolism. The safety mechanism was killing the patient. "It's not a clot!" Evander yelled back, his thumb hovering over the interface. "It's the altitude sensor. The Mk5 wasn't calibrated for a combat ascent rate. It's engaging the auto-clamp." "Override it," Odette Stormvale's voice barked in his ear. She was strapped into the jump seat opposite them, her tablet casting a pale blue glow on her anxious face. "Fix it, Dornhurst." "I can't override it from the screen. The software is locked out to prevent accidental shut-off," Evander snapped. He looked at Norabella. The chief of surgery, usually the picture of imperious composure, looked terrified. Her hands were deep in the patient's open chest, manually massaging the heart, trying to maintain perfusion while the machine failed. "Evander, his pressure is dropping," Norabella pleaded, stripped of all rank, just a desperate doctor with a dying man in her hands. "Do something." Evander reached into his pocket for a hemostat, realized he didn't have his own gear, and grabbed a pair from the sterile tray sliding around on the floor. "I have to bypass the sensor physically," Evander said. "Norabella, when I tell you, you need to crimp the outflow line manually. If you don't, backflow will blow the reservoir." "You're going to open the housing?" Norabella's eyes widened. "That voids the sterility. That voids the—" "He's dead in 30 seconds if I don't," Evander roared. "Do you want a sterile corpse or a living patient? Crimp the line." Norabella hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. She moved her hand to the clear tubing. "Ready?" Evander didn't wait. He jammed the tip of the hemostat into the seam of the plastic casing on the side of the Mk5, twisting violently. The plastic cracked. He wasn't following the manual he wrote. He was following the engineering flaws he had discovered during the prototype phase. Flaws St. Jude's administration had ignored to save money on the rollout. He found the pressure transducer wire. It was a thin, yellow filament. "Crimping!" Norabella shouted. Evander ripped the wire out. The machine's alarm stopped instantly. The hum of the pump changed from a strained whine to a steady, rhythmic thrum. "Release!" Evander ordered. Norabella let go of the line. Blood surged through the clear tubing, dark and venous, returning bright red and oxygenated. The patient's monitor, which had been flatlining, began to show a slow, artificial pulse generated by the machine. Evander slumped back against the helicopter wall, wiping his forehead with his forearm. He watched the numbers climb. MAP, 65. SPO2, 92%. Life. Norabella checked the surgical field, verifying hemostasis. She looked up at Evander. In the red light, the antagonism of the boardroom felt 1,000 miles away. There was only the shared, primal relief of a save. "Stable," she breathed. "Flow is stable." Evander looked at his hands. They were trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. He looked at the shattered plastic of the multi-million-dollar prototype. "You're going to have to explain that to maintenance," he muttered. "I'll buy you a new hospital if this man lives," Odette said, her voice grim. She unbuckled and leaned forward, checking the patient's face. "ETA to the site is 10 minutes. Keep him alive, Dornhurst. You just bought yourself a lot of leverage." Evander looked at the patient properly for the first time. The man was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and a face that looked vaguely familiar, though covered in an oxygen mask and surgical drapes. "Who is he?" Evander asked. "Who warrants 2 Black Hawks and a kidnapping?" Odette looked at him, her eyes hard. "You didn't see him. You don't know him. You are treating a physiology, not a person. Remember that." The flight smoothed out as they reached cruising altitude over the countryside. The city was gone, replaced by the dark expanse of rural woodland below. The noise in the cabin settled into a monotonous drone, allowing for conversation that didn't require shouting, though they kept the headsets on. Evander sat watching the flow rate on the Mk5, making micro-adjustments to the heparin drip. Ironic, considering he had been fired for refusing to give heparin hours ago. Norabella was inspecting the suture lines on the patient's chest. She worked with undeniable skill, her hand steady now. She glanced at Evander, then looked away. Then looked back. "You were right," she said. It was barely a whisper over the comms. Evander didn't look up from the monitor. "About the pump?" "About the patient this morning. The craniotomy." She sighed, a sound of immense fatigue. "Cedric was impulsive. The labs came back after you left. His platelets were lower than we thought. If he had pushed that bolus, he would have stroked out," Evander finished. "And you let them fire me anyway." Norabella stiffened. "It wasn't my call, Evander. Crestwood and the board. Cedric brings in 10 million a year in grants. You're a nurse, a brilliant one, but replaceable. Or so they thought." "I stood there," Evander said, his voice cold. "I stood in that office and you looked at the floor. You knew I was right, and you let them strip my license to save Cedric's ego." "I didn't think they'd go that far," she defended weakly. "I thought they'd just suspend you." "You signed the termination papers, Norabella. I saw your signature." She fell silent. There was no defense for that. In the hierarchy of medicine, she had chosen power over truth. It was the original sin of administration. "Stop bickering," Odette interrupted, her voice cutting through the static. "The past is irrelevant. The only thing that matters is the asset." Evander looked at Odette. "The asset has a name, and a heart failure history, judging by the scarring I saw when the drapes shifted. Previous CABG, maybe 5 years ago." Odette hesitated, then nodded. "Bypass in 2019. Look, Dornhurst, you're read in now, whether you like it or not. This is Elias Thorne." Evander froze. Elias Thorne. The name was synonymous with clandestine intelligence. He wasn't a politician. He was the man who brokered the deals politicians were too afraid to sign. He was an architect of treaties and a ghost in the machine of global defense. "The peacekeeper?" Evander asked. "I thought he was retired in Switzerland." "He was," Odette said, "until he decided to come in from the cold with a hard drive full of data that half the Eastern Hemisphere wants to vaporize. We were extracting him when he went into cardiac arrest. We diverted to St. Jude's for stabilization, but our intel suggested a localized threat team was moving on the hospital. We had to lift him mid-surgery." Evander stared at the unconscious man. "You lifted a man with an open chest because of a threat team? Is that why Cedric was acting so strange? Was he spooked?" "Dr. Grayson Hall doesn't know anything," Odette scoffed. "He's just an arrogant civilian. But Administrator Crestwood, Let's just say his financial records are being looked at by my colleagues right now. Why do you think he was so eager to get rid of the only competent witness in the ICU? Evander felt a chill that had nothing to do with the open cabin doors. You think my firing was arranged? I think Crestwood was clearing the deck, Odette said. Maybe he knew we were coming. Maybe he knew you'd ask too many questions when a ghost patient showed up. Or maybe he just wanted the ICU staffed by people who follow orders without thinking. Either way, you're safer here than you are in that city. Safe? Evander gestured to the open door and the dark forest rushing by below. I'm in a helicopter with a dying spy and a surgeon who sold me out. You're alive, Odette said, and you have a job to do. Thorne has to wake up. He has to give us the encryption key before he expires. That is the mission. Keep the blood moving to his brain until he talks. After that, Evander pressed. After that, we see if you can be repatriated, she said, vague and terrifying. Evander looked back at the patient. He wasn't just keeping a man alive. He was keeping a secret alive. He checked the MK5 again. The battery indicator flashed yellow. 15 minutes remaining. We need power, Evander said. The battery is draining faster than the manual said it would. The bypass maneuver I did bypassed the power save mode too. We're descending, the pilot announced. Landing zone in sight. Site B. Evander looked out the door. Below them, in the middle of a dense forest, lights were flickering on. A runway. A hangar. It looked like a scar on the earth, hidden from the world. The descent into Site B was aggressive. The pilot dropped the Black Hawk like a stone, flaring at the last second to cushion the impact. The wheels hit concrete with a jarring thud that rattled Evander's teeth. Go! 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 Odette was unbuckling before the rotors stopped. The side doors were swarmed by ground crew in hazmat-style suits and military fatigues. They weren't hospital porters. They were soldiers. A gurney was shoved up to the helicopter door. "Transfer on my count!" Evander shouted, taking charge of the lines. He wasn't going to let some eager private rip the cannula out. "Norabella, watch the aortic root. If that jostles, he bleeds out. 1, 2, 3, lift!" They slid Elias Thorne onto the waiting gurney. Evander jumped down onto the tarmac, holding the MK5 unit like a briefcase of nuclear codes. The ground was wet, the air smelling of pine and jet fuel. They ran. The gurney rattled over the concrete toward a massive blast door set into the side of a hill. It looked like a bunker from the Cold War, repurposed for modern horrors. Evander ran alongside the gurney, his eyes glued to the pump display. Battery, 8%. "Where is the power source?" Evander shouted at the soldier flanking him. "I need 220 volts, pure sine wave now." "Trauma 1 is prepped," the soldier yelled back. They burst through the blast doors into a long, sterile, concrete tunnel. The lighting was harsh, fluorescent white. The transition from the dark, noisy night to this antiseptic tomb was disorienting. They reached the trauma bay, a room that looked more like a NASA clean room than an operating theater. Walls of monitors, banks of servers blinking in the corner, and a surgical table that looked like it cost more than Evander's entire neighborhood. "Plug in!" Evander dove for the wall outlet, dragging the heavy power cord of the MK5. He slammed it into the socket just as the battery indicator turned red. The machine hummed a grateful, deeper note as it switched to AC power. "Vitals," Norabella called out, scrubbing in at a sink that appeared from a wall panel. "Stable," Evander said, watching the trace. "But his temp is down to 34 degrees. We need to warm him or he won't clot." "We have to close him," Norabella said, snapping on gloves. "I can't leave his chest open in this environment. The air filtration isn't rated for long-term exposure." "No," a voice came from the doorway. They all turned. A man stood there, wearing a suit that mirrored Crestwood's, but worn with the careless authority of a man who owned the building. He was older, with a scar running through his left eyebrow. This was Director Vance. "You don't close him yet," Vance said calmly. "He needs to speak." "He's under general anesthesia and on bypass," Norabella argued, finding her spine again. "He can't speak. If we lighten the sedation, he'll go into shock." "Wake him up," Vance ordered. "We have a window of opportunity. The encryption key rotates in 20 minutes. If he doesn't give us the sequence, this entire extraction was a waste of jet fuel." "You'll kill him," Evander said, stepping between the director and the patient. "The pain alone from an open sternotomy without sedation will cause a catecholamine surge that will blow the graft sites. You wake him up, he dies in agony." Vance looked at Evander. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. "You must be the nurse. Ms. Stormvale speaks highly of your improvisation, but you are mistaken about your role here. You are mechanics. Fix the machine so the asset functions. Wake him up." "I won't do it," Norabella said. Vance nodded to the two soldiers by the door. They stepped forward, hands on their sidearms. "Dr. Ravensmere," Vance said softly. "St. Jude's is a civilian facility. This is a black site. The Board of Nursing has no jurisdiction here. But I do. Wake him up." Norabella looked at Evander, her eyes wide with panic. She was out of her depth. This wasn't hospital politics. This was brutality. Evander looked at the patient, then at the soldiers, then at Vance. He realized they weren't asking. They were going to do it with or without them. If Evander stepped aside, they'd probably just inject adrenaline and hope for the best. "I'll do it," Evander said quietly. "Evander, no!" Norabella gasped. "If we do it your way," Evander said to Vance, "he dies and you get nothing. If we do it my way, you get your key, and he might survive." Vance raised an eyebrow. "And what is your way?" "We don't wake him fully. I can titrate the propofol down, bring him to a twilight state. He'll be able to hear and whisper, but the dissociation will manage the pain. But I need Norabella to hold the heart manually, to stabilize it against the surge. And I need you," he pointed at Odette, "to be the one asking the questions. He knows you. He trusts you. If this guy asks," he jerked a thumb at Vance, "Thorne will spike his pressure and die out of spite." Vance considered this. He checked his watch. "You have 5 minutes to prep, 10 minutes to get the key." Evander turned to the pump. He looked at Norabella. "Get your hands inside. Hold the graft. Don't let it blow." "You're making a deal with the devil, Evander," she whispered as she stepped up to the table. "I'm buying time," Evander whispered back, dialing down the sedation flow. "Just keep him together." As the drug levels dropped, the rhythm on the monitor began to speed up. Elias Thorne's eyelids fluttered. The room held its breath. Evander stood at the head of the bed, leaning close to the man's ear. "Mr. Thorne," Evander said, his voice calm, professional, the voice that had guided thousands of patients through pain. "You are safe. You are in a hospital. I need you to open your eyes." Elias Thorne's eyes opened. They were milky, unfocused, then sharpened on Evander's face. He didn't see a spy. He didn't see a soldier. He saw a nurse. "Help!" Thorne rasped. "We are helping," Evander promised, "but we need the key." The door to the trauma bay locked with a heavy, magnetic thud. Evander realized with a sinking feeling that getting the key might be the easy part. Getting out of this room after the key was delivered, that was going to be the problem. The silence in the underground trauma bay was heavy, a suffocating blanket of pressurized air, broken only by the rhythmic whoosh-click of the Mk5 pump and the low, menacing hum of the server banks lining the far wall. The room smelled of ozone, isopropyl alcohol, and the metallic tang of dried blood. It was a tomb disguised as a hospital, a place where the Hippocratic oath went to die. Evander stood at the head of the surgical table, his hand resting gently on Elias Thorne's forehead. He wasn't just a nurse in that moment. He was the anchor in a storm of physiological chaos. He watched the numbers on the monitor, the heart rate, the arterial pressure, the oxygen saturation, dancing on the edge of catastrophe. "Titrating propofol down to 10 mics, Evander announced, his voice steady, despite the cold sensation of gun barrels he knew were trained on his back. "I'm lightening the sedation. He's going to surface, but he won't be lucid. He'll be in the grey zone." He looked at the surgeon. "Norabella, his pressure is going to spike the moment his brain registers the pain. You are the dam. Do not let the aortic suture line burst. If that graft blows, he bleeds out in 4 seconds. Norabella didn't look up. Her hands were deep in the open chest cavity, gloved fingers pressing against the Dacron graft that replaced a section of the patient's aorta. She was sweating profusely, her surgical mask damp and clinging to her face. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the beating heart beneath her fingers. "I have it, Evander," she whispered, her voice tight with terror. "Just get the damn code so we can put him back under. I can feel the pressure building against the arterial wall. It's like holding back a fire hose." Director Vance stepped closer, his polished Oxford shoes clicking sharply on the sterile floor. The sound was obscenely loud in the tension. He held a secure, military-grade tablet, the screen glowing with a waiting encryption prompt. His face was impassive, the face of a man who viewed human life as a variable in an equation. "Miss Stormvale," Vance said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "Ask the question. We are running out of time." Odette moved to Evander's side. She looked shaken. The tactical certainty she had displayed on the bridge, the shouting, the command, was eroding under the grim reality of what they were doing. They were torturing a dying man for data. She looked at Thorne's pale, slack face, a man she had clearly known in a different life. She leaned down, close to his ear. "Elias," she whispered. "It's Odette. Listen to me. We're safe. But the network is compromised. We need the handshake key for the Zurich server. The secondary protocol. You have to give it to me." Thorne's eyelids fluttered. The twilight anesthesia was stripping away his inhibitions, peeling back the layers of unconsciousness, but it left the primal fear intact. His brow furrowed. A low moan escaped his lips, vibrating through the ventilator tube. His heart rate on the monitor began to climb. 110, 120, 130. The pitch of the pulse oximeter rose, a frantic electronic bird crying out in warning. "Pressure is rising," Norabella hissed, leaning her weight into her hands. "Map is 90, 95. The graft is pulsing against my fingers. Evander, he's fighting it! Hold it!" Evander ordered, his eyes locked on the monitor. He leaned in, his voice dropping to that specific, commanding register nurses use to guide patients through the worst moments of their lives. "Mr. Thorne, listen to my voice. You are in pain, but you are safe. I need you to focus. Give them the number and you can sleep. Just give them the number." Thorne's eyes snapped open. They were wild, unfocused, rolling in their sockets. He wasn't seeing the room. He was seeing ghosts. His lips moved around the endotracheal tube, trying to form words. A rasping sound emerged, bubbling with fluid. The trials. "Not the trials, Elias," Odette urged, her voice cracking. "The key. The sequence." 7, Thorne wheezed, the word barely intelligible. "Alpha, Indigo, St. Jude, 4. Vance typed furiously on the tablet, his eyes narrowing. Keep going. We need the full string. St. Jude? Evander frowned, the name jarring him. Why would a Black Ops encryption code include the name of a civilian Catholic hospital? St. Jude. 9. Crestwood. The room froze. The hum of the server seemed to vanish. Even Vance paused, his finger hovering over the screen. Did he just say Crestwood? Norabella asked, her head snapping up, her hands trembling inside the patient's chest. My administrator! Focus on the patient! Vance snapped, his composure cracking for a microsecond. Finish it, Thorne. The final sequence. Thorne arched his back, a violent spasm of pain cutting through the light sedation. His eyes locked onto Evander's, pleading, terrified. Crestwood. Black. Thursday. The monitor screamed. VTARC. He's dumping catecholamines! Evander shouted, grabbing the syringe of propofol. His adrenaline is spiking. Bolusing propofol. Norabella, watch out. The line is tearing, Norabella screamed. It happened in slow motion. The suture line on the aortic graft, stressed beyond its limit by the surge in blood pressure, gave way. A jet of bright red arterial blood sprayed up from the chest cavity, hitting the overhead surgical light with a wet, sickening smack before raining down on them. Clamp it! Evander roared. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't wait for the surgeon. He abandoned the sedation, grabbed a vascular clamp from the instrument tray, and reached over the sterile field. He violated every protocol he had adhered to for 20 years. He dove his bare hands into the open chest alongside Norabella. Vance, get back! Odette shouted, shoving the director away as blood pooled rapidly on the floor, making the tiles slick and treacherous. Evander couldn't see. The blood was in his eyes, on his glasses. He could only feel. He felt the slick warmth of the aorta, the frantic, dying flutter of the heart, and the ragged tear in the graft. It was slipping away. I can't find the proximal end, Norabella cried, panic seizing her. I have it, Evander growled. He guided his fingers blindly, following the anatomy he knew better than his own face. He felt the pulsing tear. He jammed the clamp down, feeling the metal ratchet click, once, twice. The spray stopped. The monitor screamed a flatline alarm for 3 agonizing seconds. Beep! Before catching the artificial rhythm of the MK5 pump again. Thump, whoosh, thump, whoosh. We have it, Evander breathed, his hands shaking violently inside the patient's chest. He wiped his face with his shoulder, smearing blood across his cheek. We have control. He's back. Vance looked at the tablet. The screen flashed green. Access granted. He didn't look at the patient who had nearly died giving him the code. He didn't look at the medical team covered in gore. He looked at the soldiers standing by the door. Upload the files, Vance ordered coldly. Then sanitize the room. Evander looked up, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sanitize. Vance smiled, a cold, bureaucratic expression that chilled Evander more than the blood on his hands. Mr. Thorne has served his purpose. And you too. Well, you've heard the code. St. Jude, Crestwood. You're smart people. You can figure out why you can't leave. The realization hit Evander like a physical blow. It wasn't just a code, it was a confession. The grants, Evander said, his voice low. He looked at Norabella. The $10 million Cedric brings in every year. It's not for neurosurgery research. Norabella stared at him, horror dawning in her eyes. The MK5 prototypes. We were the only test site. The patients. The unexplained failures in the ICU. Field tests, Odette said, stepping away from Vance. Her hand moved to the holster at her hip, but she didn't draw. Not yet. You were testing military-grade bypass tech on civilians to work out the bugs before deployment. Crestwood was laundering the payments as research grants. Cedric was picking the candidates, patients with no family, or complex cases where death wouldn't look suspicious. And you, Vance said to Evander, were the glitch in the system. You were too good. You kept saving the failures. You kept documenting the pump errors. We had to get you out. So you fired me, Evander said. You staged the fight with Cedric. We needed you gone, Vance agreed. But irony is a cruel mistress. The system failed on the one man we couldn't afford to lose, and you were the only mechanic in town. He gestured to the soldiers. Disconnect the pump. If you disconnect him, he dies, Norabella said, standing tall. That is the point, Doctor, Vance said. Thorn is a loose end. You are loose ends. We have the data. The soldiers stepped forward. Wait, Evander shouted. You have the data, but you don't have the decryption key for the biological files. Vance paused. What are you talking about? Evander's mind raced. He had to use the only weapon he had, medical jargon and the arrogance of non-medical personnel. The MK5 isn't just a pump, it's a biometric vault. Thorn didn't just carry data on a hard drive, he encoded it into his own physiology. That's why he crashed. The drive is linked to his cardiac rhythm. If he flatlines before you run the export sequence, the data corrupts. It self-destructs. It was complete nonsense, pure technobabble fabrication. But Vance was a bureaucrat, not a doctor. Vance hesitated. He looked at the servers. The download bar was at 40%. Is that true? Vance asked Odette. Odette looked at Evander. She saw the desperate glint in his eye. She saw the nurse who had saved a life with a hemostat and a plastic casing. She made her choice. Yes, Odette lied smoothly. It's the dead man's switch protocol. If the pulse stops before the transfer is complete, the servers wipe themselves. Vance cursed. He waved the soldiers back. Keep him alive until the download finishes. Then, we finish this. The download is slow, Evander said, checking the pump. And the oxygen tanks on the Mark V are empty. We need to switch to the wall supply. Do it, Vance barked. Evander moved to the wall regulators. He looked at Odette. He made a subtle motion with his eyes toward the pressure valve. Odette nodded imperceptibly. Evander grabbed the high-pressure oxygen line, but instead of connecting it to the machine, he cranked the regulator to maximum, 50 psi. Norabella, drop to the floor, Evander yelled. He jammed the high-pressure line into the intake valve of the MK5's waste canister. Boom! The plastic canister exploded under the pressure. It wasn't a frag grenade, but in a sealed concrete room, the concussion was deafening. Shards of plastic and bloody fluid sprayed the room like shrapnel. The overhead lights shattered. The room plunged into darkness, lit only by the red emergency strobes. Move! Evander grabbed the heavy surgical tray and swung it blindly. He connected with a soldier's helmet. Secure the asset! Vance screamed from the darkness. No, Odette's voice came from the shadows. Secure the exit. The chaos in the dark was absolute. Evander felt a hand grab his scrub top. It was Odette. The back corridor, she shouted over the confusion. Norabella has the gurney. They pushed. Evander, Norabella, and Odette drove the heavy gurney with Elias Thorn, still attached to the battery backup pump, through the rear blast doors. They slammed the locking mechanism shut, sealing Vance and his soldiers in the trauma bay. They ran down the service tunnel, the wheels of the gurney screeching. Where are we going? Norabella gasped, her face smeared with blood and soot. There's nowhere to go. We're in the middle of a forest. The helipad, Odette said. The pilots are mine. They're 161st SOAR, not Vance's private security. Once they know Vance is rogue, they'll lift us. They burst out into the night air. The rain had stopped. The two Black Hawks sat silent on the tarmac. Odette pulled a flare gun from her flight suit and fired a red star into the sky. The lead pilot saw them. The turbines began to whine immediately. "Load up!" Odette commanded. They shoved the gurney into the bay. Evander scrambled in after it, pulling Norabella up. As the helicopter lifted, Evander looked down. He saw the blast doors of the bunker open. Figures spilled out, weapons raised. But they were too late. The Black Hawk banked hard, leaving the black site behind. 3 hours later, the helicopter touched down on the roof of St. Jude's Medical Center. But this wasn't a covert landing. It was a spectacle. Odette had called ahead, not to the administration, but to the FBI and the press. As the rotors slowed, Evander saw the flashing lights of police cruisers surrounding the hospital entrance below. He saw federal agents swarming the executive suite. He stepped out of the helicopter, his scrubs ruined, his face exhausted, but his head high. Administrator Crestwood was being led out of the main doors in handcuffs, a jacket over his head. Dr. Cedric Grayson Hall was right behind him, looking pale and small, stripped of his white coat and his arrogance. Evander walked to the edge of the helipad. Clementine Hartmore was there, standing by the roof access door, holding a blanket. She looked at Evander, bloody, battered, standing next to a black ops helicopter and the chief of surgery. "Evander," she whispered, I thought you were fired." Evander looked at Norabella. The surgeon looked at him. There was a shift in the universe between them. The hierarchy was gone. They were just survivors. "I was," Evander said, taking the blanket. "But I think I'm being rehired, with a promotion." Norabella nodded. "Director of Nursing sounds about right, and full autonomy on safety protocols. And a new coffee mug," Evander added. Odette Stormvale stepped forward. She handed Evander a secure drive, the real data from the MK5. "Vance is in custody," she said quietly. "Thorne is stable in the ICU. The testimony on this drive will put Crestwood and Cedric away for life. You did good, Dornhurst." Evander looked out over the city. The sun was coming up, painting the skyline in gold and pink. The rain was gone. He was tired, his body ached, but the weight on his chest, the weight of being a liability, had vanished. He wasn't just a nurse, he was the line between life and death, and he held the line. "Clementine," Evander said, wrapping the blanket around his shoulders. "Is bed 4 still labile?" Clementine smiled, tears in her eyes. "Potassium is stable. He's asking for you." Evander nodded. He turned to the door, walking back into the hospital he had sworn to protect, not as a servant, but as a guardian. "Let's go to work." The story of Evander Dornhurst serves as a powerful reminder that true authority does not come from titles, expensive suits, or administrative power. It comes from competence, integrity, and the courage to stand for what is right, even when the institutions we serve turn against us. In a world obsessed with status, Evander reminds us that the most important person in the room is often the one doing the work, holding the hand, and keeping the heart beating. Dignity is not given. It is practiced. If you enjoyed this story of redemption, high-stakes medicine, and justice, please consider gently tapping that like button, sharing this with a friend who needs a hero, and subscribing for more stories that celebrate the unsung heroes among us.